Okay, so let me introduce our next speaker this morning, Sayori Ghoshal from the Max Planck Institute, and she's going to be speaking to us this morning on calculative reasoning, colonial tool to democratic compulsion. Let me turn things over to you.
Thank you everyone for being here. I want to thank the organizers and the INI staff for organizing and bringing this together. This is an amazing workshop. Also, especially thanks to Adrian Rice for inviting me. I'm so honored to have this opportunity to share my research, my work in progress with all of you. And I'm especially thankful for the slightly unique opportunity to be able to pose like big questions, emerging themes, without necessarily having to answer them all. That was what the manifesto said. I have a relatively short presentation because I wanted to keep quite a bit of time for discussion and Q&A. This is a work in progress, so I would be happy to discuss further, elaborate on certain things that I might have missed out on the presentation, and simply get as much feedback as possible. To just begin with my larger project, of which I'll be presenting today, a part of which I'll be presenting today. So I'm currently working on my first monograph, which is a revision of my doctoral dissertation. And in that, I trace the emergence of statistical sciences in colonial India and up to post-colonial India, late 20th century. And in doing that, I focus primarily on how that history of the rise of statistical sciences, and when I say statistical sciences, I include not just the rise of applied statistics or statistics as a sub-discipline of math in India, but I'm also looking at the rise of race science, demography, and those kind of allied disciplines, because they only emerge as very specific and watertight disciplines much later. When they are emerging, they are all in there together. So in looking at the history of these disciplines, I'm particularly focusing on the discipline's socio-political impact on the lives of communities. So how, through these knowledge productions, these disciplinary knowledge productions, the social political lives of ethnic communities, religious, racial, caste communities are impacted, how even the perception of such communities or the perception of identities of such communities or how to demarcate these communities are informed by this history. In presenting a part of this research today, I'll primarily focus on the socio-political context in which statistical sciences are emerging and being shaped in colonial and post-colonial India. Let me start with a story. So this is the late 19th century, British colonial India. So 1872, the British colonial state introduces the census for the first time. Now, there were some versions of the census of enumeration in India in pre-British state. So for instance, the Mughal state had enumerations of land, agricultural output, and that kind of thing. But this was a watershed moment, a critical moment, because the census for the first time is not just enumerating economic or agricultural categories, but are counting people and certain aspects of people that have never been enumerated before. So it kind of serves almost as one of the first interactions between Indians and the enumeration of previously unenumerated categories, such as caste, religion, or even age. So the census data collector would go around with his questionnaire, asking people their age, for instance, among other things. And a lot of people would often fail to specify their age precisely. And this would often be the answer. So they would ask, so what is your age? And people would often say, oh, 20 40. This is a common phrase in Hindi, which basically means, oh, around 20 or 40. So now this, of course, is an absurd range. And this particular experience then led to the colonial narrative that emerged at this point, that Indians, or at least the Indian mass, was inherently non-enumerative and non-quantitative in their thinking. And this alleged absence of enumerative thinking, interestingly, also came to be internalized by elite Indians, at least in part. The distinction was that while the colonial Indian narrative was that Indians are non-enumerative, and this is inherent because of their racial distinction from Europeans, the Indian elites would say, yes, we agree, the Indian mass or the Indian public is inherently non-enumerative, non-quantitative in their thinking, but this has nothing to do with race. This has to do with lack of access or pedagogy, and this is something that can be changed. And this becomes their central and primary motivation to work towards making statistical sciences an Indian enterprise. So to push back against this colonial narrative that Indians cannot be enumerative, they start focusing on not only building the discipline of statistics among Indian practitioners, but within a few decades, we'll also see how they are pushing for a pedagogy, dissemination of this, so that the Indian mass can also become enumerative and quantitative in thinking, which at that time starts becoming interchangeable with being modern and rational. Now, this story for me highlights three things that this talk is moving towards. These are the three emerging themes or questions that I would like to discuss. So first, this story for me highlights that we can historicize not just the disciplines or fields of application of the statistical sciences, so not just historicize the discipline or the emergence of the discipline, but also to historicize how enumeration or quantitative thinking or calculation as a mode of reasoning itself has a history. So it's not as ubiquitous or as natural or as ahistorical as popular notions, contemporary popular notions would have us believe. The other thing is that there were socio-political motivations, not just for the emergence of the discipline. So it's not just there was a socio-political context in which the discipline emerged, but even the direction in which the discipline will develop, or the motivations for doing certain kind of things or choosing certain questions within the discipline. So basically, the content of the discipline is also at times informed by these socio-political contexts. And this is not to say that there is no intellectual motivations at all, but I'm saying the socio-political motivations are often equally important along with the intellectual or biographical causes of a certain shift in the discipline or certain development in the disciplines. And finally, for me, it shows that there is not only a history or singular history of statistics, numerical thinking, and objectivity, but there are multiple histories, multiple processes, multiple directions in which we can trace the development of these emergences and the development of these disciplines. And here I'm basically referring to a lot of important scholarship on the history of statistical sciences that have come up, but within the context of Europe and America. And by looking at this Indian history, I'm saying that there is another history possible that is developing in connection with these European histories, because we'll see there are actual collaborations between historical actors. But nonetheless, it is, to a large extent, a distinct direction, a distinct development of statistical sciences, distinct given their socio-political motivations, given the particular questions they are picking up at certain times, motivated by the larger contexts of colonialism, anti-colonialism, and nationalism. Before moving further, it probably helps to clarify what all I'm including when I say statistical reasoning. So just as I mentioned in the census story, there is, of course, to begin with, the basic demographic data that is being collected through these census. So I begin there. So that is one set of statistical data that I look at. So there is the question of, say, how many people in a particular caste group, how many people in a particular religious group. Then you have the demographic data, age, gender. So all of these are collected and published in the census reports. These are disseminated and they have a certain impact on the socio-political lives of communities. So I'm looking at, I take into consideration that data. But then there is also the demographic data that is calculated of this collected data. So you can't ask people the birth rate of a community or the mortality rate of a community. So the data is collected, the demographic data, and you basically take into consideration averages, and this kind of data, growth rate of a community, birth rate of a community, is then calculated from that data. So I'm also taking that into consideration. So once these census reports start circulating, a lot of Indian intellectuals also increasingly become invested in these questions of community demographic strength. Political privileges come to be based on the idea of which communities are marginalized and so on. So they also start doing their own calculations in their public writings using these data. They also start doing their own calculation of percentage of growth, say, in a certain region. And in the early 20th century, we have a kind of a debate called the Hindu dying race. Suddenly, elite upper caste Hindus become concerned following the census publications that there is a larger percentage of Muslims than they had expected, and that becomes a source of anxiety for upper caste Hindus. They also start calculating growth rates, and some of them even go on to predict that in the next, like exact calculations of in the next 400 years or 420 years, Hindus are going to be replaced as a majority community by Muslims. So all of these debates are also emerging out of the ability to calculate these kinds of categories, which did not exist before the censuses. And finally, I'm also looking at the more sophisticated analytical development in the discipline. So for instance, the development and the discussions around methodologies of data collection, which Indian intellectuals are engaging in starting in the 1920s, 30s, increasingly in the 40s and 50s, when the shift from the post-colonial to the post-colonial state is taking place, basically to discussing methods, which method of data collection is more efficient or more cost-effective for a nation as vast as India. So there is a debate around, say, sample surveys, whether to go for full census enumerations or to go for random sample surveys. There is also the use of correlation analysis. And finally, a significant development happens in the area of distance coefficient, which I will discuss at some length. So to go back to the Indian nationalist response to this colonial idea of Indians being non-enumerative, so on the one hand, as I said, they conceded to the narrative that yes, most Indian masses are non-enumerative, non-quantitative in their thinking, but that becomes for them a push to develop pedagogy, to develop the discipline as an Indian enterprise, which is to say to develop it as a common practice or a disciplinary practice among Indian intellectuals. So that becomes their motivation. But at the same time, in turning to developing the discipline and claiming a special place for themselves as Indian intellectuals, as experts, they also critically engage with the available colonial data set. So various kinds of the colonial state is not just conducting the census. There is, say, the police department, which has a data set of criminal statistics. The health department has some data with especially the plague deaths and that kind of disease percentages in certain regions and so on. So Indian intellectuals, whenever they have these data available, they are engaging with it and trying to critique the data, using it at times, but also sometimes highlighting the flaws, the problems with the colonial data collection. To discuss at length one instance of such critical engagement, we have to turn to one of the very popular colonial administrator, popular, infamous, that kind of popular, colonial administrator, anthropologist, Herbert Riesly. He was posted in India, and this is the late 19th century when he's in India. So administrator, anthropologist is actually a term devised by scholars because there are a lot of colonial administrators who are actually engaged in this kind of work, and they are not trained as anthropologists, but they are doing a lot of anthropological work, and it makes sense to call them not like professional anthropologists, but at least administrator anthropologists, because uh, they are also introducing a lot of methods, categories, and techniques in the subcontinent, which are then taken up or at least become diving boards for Indian intellectuals to develop or take the discipline further. So their work is not, in that sense, completely irrelevant. So Herbert Riesly is important because he introduces in the late 19th century the technique, the method of anthropometry into the subcontinent. So anthropometry is basically measuring physical features of individuals and then extrapolating that to the community and basically making race science conclusions out of that. So anthropometry was a method of race science that is being used at this time. And he's the first anthropologist who is very invested in this. He introduces the method, he collects a lot of data, and this is like a page from his data that is published in a book called Tribes and Castes of Bengal. This is a report published in 1891. And this Riesly's data, although this is published in the late 19th century, 1891, Riesly's data keeps appearing in Indian intellectual, Indian nationalist discourses when they're engaging with this data to highlight its flaws, to use it to make other conclusions, to dismiss his method or his premise of data collection into the 1920s and 30s, as we will see. So a lot of Indian intellectuals engage with this data, but one of the more important anthropologists who does this is B.S. Guho. He was trained in anthropology from Harvard, and in 1932 he decides to undertake a similar survey like Riesly, a similar anthropometric survey. He claims that his primary agenda is to collect anthropometric data from all over the subcontinent and basically produce a map of the racial composition of the nation. But at the same time, he also wanted to use this opportunity to the availability, the access he was granted to the subcontinent's data. He wanted to use this opportunity to compare his data with Riesly's and point out where Riesly's data was wrong or incorrect. He wanted to basically revise Riesly's data. And he did end up revising. In fact, he ended up rejecting some of Riesly's premises and therefore entire data sets. For instance, Riesly had concluded when he did his survey on the region of Bengal, he had concluded that Bengalis, based on his anthropometric calculations and race science arguments, he had concluded that Bengalis had non-Aryan racial origin. And this, at that time, was considered racially inferior to having an Aryan lineage. So B.S. Guho, who was a Bengali, did not take this lightly. So today, Bengalis are predominantly, one could say, identified as a linguistic community. But during the early decades of the 20th century, when B.S. Guho is working, Bengali, very much like other identities at that time, was a contested category. So while some argued that it was a linguistic identity, some insisted that there was a strict caste and religious dimension to it, and others said that this was a territorial identity. So any community residing in the administrative region of Bengal should be considered Bengali. So these were the contestations. Now, Riesly had belonged to the latter classification. He believed that Bengalis were a territorial identity, and therefore he had included certain Adivasi or tribal communities who resided in the region of Bengal. Guho was not happy with this identity. He challenged this view. he argued that occupying geographical territories alone could not qualify one as a Bengali. So the Adivasis in the hilly areas of Bengal were not true Bengalis according to him. They only resided in the region. Including these groups had affected Riesli's data, and thereby he had been led to the conclusion that because these groups had non-Aryan racial features, and therefore including these groups in his definition had made Riesli conclude that Bengalis are non-Aryan. This was Guho's challenge. So basically he not only rejected Riesli's conclusion, he basically rejected the premise of Riesli's classification and data collection. He rejected the way he had defined, the way Riesli had defined the category and went about collecting data. But this is not to say that Riesli, it's not an easy conclusion to say that Riesli was incorrect and Guho was not, because while Riesli had displayed in this his racist bias, his colonial bias, Guho is also revealing his own upper casteist bias by not including Adivasi communities, or even by conceding to the idea that non-Aryan lineage is racially inferior. But it's interesting because this nonetheless is representative of the nationalist critique of colonial data. In this instance, the premise of data collection is undermined, and the nationalists argue that as Indian intellectuals who are more familiar with the social cultural world, they will actually be better at being anthropologists, at being statisticians, at collecting these kinds of data and analyzing them, because they, by virtue of their upbringing and their location, are more aware of who should be counted in which category and what similarity of one data set to another, in this case, actually indicate. So this evolved not only an argument about the ability of Indians to be better practitioners of these emerging sciences, but that they were more adept in doing this than their colonial counterparts. Now, some other examples just to give a sense of the engagement with colonial data, the critical engagement. So there is Mahalanobis, one of India's foremost statisticians, who I'll talk about in a bit. He is also publishing at least 2 articles and actually some more, revising some of Riesli's data. So this is going on into the 1930s. There is someone called Jyotindra Mohan Datto. Jyotindra Mohan Datto is Mahalanobis's colleague. He's a fellow at the Royal Statistical Society in London. He's also publishing this article called The Need of an Advisory Committee for Indian Official Statistical Publications, basically critiquing the lack of any kind of centralization and proper dissemination of the data collected by the colonial state among people. So lack of organization, lack of proper statistical data availability to the public. So we see that there is the arguments, the critiques are not against the state for collecting data, but against the state for not collecting data efficiently, not publishing the data properly, not disseminating it among the public in a centralized, organized way. And finally, we also have another article called The Inaccuracies in the Bengal Census Report. So by this time, by these decades, these Indian statisticians are contributing to the debate, are critiquing how the census is being conducted, what categories are not included, and trying to engage with it. So this is not an argument for doing away with the census, but doing a better job at it. Now, throughout all these critiques, the premise is generally that the colonial state is administratively motivated. Their priority is economic profit for the colonial state, not the public welfare of the people. And this then hampers the kind of data they can collect, the way the data is collected, and the purpose for which the data is collected. And the consequent argument is that Indians who are, as I said, more familiar with the social cultural milieu, and who would prioritize public welfare because they are Indians, they would then make for better experts, better statisticians. And here, what I argue we can glean is an awareness and explicit discussion about bias in science. So there is the acknowledgement that the colonial statistics is biased because they have certain administrative and economic agenda which goes against the people's agendas. And this negatively affects the data and the data set and the conclusions. Uh, Although they are not explicitly calling themselves biased, they are not in rejecting colonial statistics and in claiming that they will serve as better experts, as better statisticians. They are not basing that argument, the latter argument, on any kind of detachment or distance or objective perspective. They are saying because we are steeped in the social cultural milieu, because we are um aware of the various relations these communities have with each other through oral history, through linguistic commonality, that we are better tuned to understand the data. We are better tuned to understand, collect, and analyze the data. So there is a sense in which the idea of doing good statistics or objective or fair statistics is not necessarily tied to an idea of distance from the field or distance from one's subjects. So there is a sense, if we consider bias as not inherently negative, there is, I think, an awareness of bias, awareness of the socio-cultural, socio-political context that necessarily impacts the statistical sciences at this point. And they use it to their benefit instead of seeing it as a problem. Now, beyond engaging with the colonial data. So it's not just, it's not as if they are only rejecting colonial data or critiquing the colonial data. They're also deeply invested in building institutions, in forming collaborations with statisticians, even in Europe at this point. So for instance, as I mentioned, India's foremost statistician is Prashanta Chandra Mahalanobis. Mahalanobis founds the first institute in India that is dedicated to statistics and led by Indians in 1931, called the Indian Statistical Institute in Bengal, in Kolkata. It's primarily a research institute at that point, but within a decade and a half, they start offering diploma and certificate courses, so they turn to pedagogy. They also have their own in-house journal, Shankha, that begins publishing immediately after the founding of the institute. In fact, Mahalanobis was trained at Cambridge, King's College, in physics, and he completed his undergrad degree and he went back to India, but unfortunately this was 1915, so he got stuck. He could never come back. But after his training in physics, he was introduced to Carl Pearson's Biometrica, the journal, and it's said that he carried back some of these issues on his journey back to India. And it was Biometrica that really first made him interested in biometrics, race science questions, and that was his journey into statistics rather than being trained in statistics. So, as I said, one of the priorities of development of statistics as a science in India was the anti-colonial motivations, but it did not mean that they wanted their research only to be relevant to the region. Although they, on the one hand, they made this argument about themselves as Indian experts who were familiar with the socio-cultural context. At the same time, they also did not want to be only relevant to the region, of course. So they wanted their methods, their application techniques to be generalizable knowledge. And they looked for international collaborations. They wanted all their methods, their results to also be valid globally, so have international implications. And so just to give a brief, this is Ronald Fisher, that's Pearson, that's K.B. Madhava, another statistician working with Mahalanobis at this time. So there is this international collaboration and network going on. And here, the relations are slightly different, in fact, quite different from the way they interact with their colonial administrators or colonial counterparts, because Indian statisticians are looking in these collaborations a recognition of a mutual recognition, a peer kind of respect. But of course, there is asymmetry, there is power relations in these networks as well. And who needs the other to establish themselves as experts is kind of evident. But without going into that yet, I wanted to discuss one prominent example of this attempt to generalize something that comes out of a specific Indian context, a specific Indian problem. And this is the Mahalanobis distance function. So in 1920, Mahalanobis received, this is the publication that comes out of the study. This is the first publication of the distance function. So in 1920, Mahalanobis received an anthropometric data set, a big data set with anthropometric features of the Anglo-Indian community in India. He was asked to use this data set and come up with conclusions about the racial features of Anglo-Indians. He also wanted to use this to compare this data set, the Anglo-Indian data set, with other existing data sets of Hindu communities, different castes, of Muslims and Indian Christians, to basically see if they had, the Anglo-Indian community and others had shared affinity with any one particular group, racial shared affinity. Now, to do this, at this point in time, in India as in Europe, the studies of racial relations at this point mainly used and relied on Carl Pearson's coefficient of racial likeness. Pearson had devised this in 1990. It basically helps determine the probability of racial relations. So Pearson's coefficient technique measured the anthropometric features of, say, the measurement of a physical stature of a group or the size of the skull. And then he would, like through that formula, he would derive the average anthropometric feature for that group. And then if you basically have averages from two groups, you can come up with the ratio using this coefficient and basically say whether or not the two groups are racially related. So it's a test of divergence. You can say, yes, they are related or they are not related. Mahalanobis used this method for the Anglo-Indian data set, but at the same time, he was quite unsatisfied with the method and he claimed that this was limited. Because he didn't want to only find out whether two groups, say group A and B, are racially related or not. He wanted to find out the magnitude of the distance. He wanted to find out to what extent they are different. So he wanted to quantify that. So this is both a nationalist urge to coming out of this urge to develop Indian statistics or contribute to statistics as a global discipline from the Indian perspective. And at the same time, it's also the nationalist urge to find out exactly how communities are related, because at this point, the Indian intellectuals are starting to envision a future post-colonial state. So they want to know exactly how the different constituent communities of the nation are related, to come up with their historical racial relations, but also to come up with how that would translate into, say, political relations in the contemporary. So there is both the disciplinary urge and the nationalist political social urge to find the magnitude of these, the relations. So while Pearson's coefficient was based on comparing the average from the two groups, Mahalanobis's intervention was basically to not just take into account the average from the two groups, but also look at the distribution of the data sets within a group. So with Pearson's method, you basically took into account the average. So it doesn't matter how the data is distributed. But with Mahalanobis, the distribution of data becomes important. And that's how he's able to figure out the magnitude of the difference between two groups. So To give an example from his publication, he organized the data in this way. So D, the one circled out there, that is the Moholy-Nagy distance for each of the communities on the left, and C is the corresponding Pearson coefficient of racial likeness. So two groups who have very different physical appearances would then have a large distance, and two groups which resembled each other or had racial relations would have a very small distance. So for instance, this table shows that the distance, this table is for Bengal Mohammedans. That's the term that is being used at that point, so indicating Bengali Muslims. So that is the community that is being compared on this page. So the distance between Bengali Muslims and Bihar Goalas is small compared to, say, Chittagong Chakma, which is the largest. So they have no racial relation with the community Chittagong Chakmas, but have racial relations with or racial overlaps with Bihari Goalas. But this is about the context in which Moholy-Nagy distance function is formulated. It does not mean that distance function remain restricted to its racial origins or origins in racial studies. It became a generalized method, something that Moholy-Nagy and other Indian statisticians wanted to do. As a generalized method, it basically could calculate, and it still is used today in a lot of contexts. It can calculate the distance between one data, a single data, and a group of data to determine whether this single data belongs to the group or is actually an outlier. For instance, today it is used in facial recognition techniques and even in fraud detection for financial transactions. So for instance, by calculating the Moholy-Nagy distance between one transaction, one single transaction, and a set of historical transactions, one is able to say whether this transaction falls within, like, is a part of the regular transaction or is a fraud transaction. So in that sense, we can say that the distance function is a success story for the nationalist agenda of producing statistics that would have roots in Indian data and context, but also would be globally relevant and relevant outside the race science discipline in which it emerged. But at the same time, it does not mean that once generalized, the socio-political context of the statistical method in which it was formulated ceases to matter completely. And for this, we need to note the final verification of the method when Moholy-Nagy is devising this. So whether the distance, say here, whether the distance between two communities as emerging from this calculation, whether the distance is correct or is a correct representation of reality or not, that verification does not come from within the discipline. That verification comes from the Indian statisticians' understanding of the socio-political reality. They are able to verify as Indians who have certain assumptions about these communities. So their upper casteist, elitist, male biases do inform this understanding. They are able to say, yes, from our social knowledge, we know that Bengali Mohammedans are closer racially to, say, Bihari Goalas and not to Chittagong Chakmas. So this method must be correct. So the final verification that the method is correct and can be generalized is still rooted or is informed by the very specific upper caste elite assumptions about caste communities, about religion and race in among Indian statisticians. Because Moholy-Nagy and other statisticians are explicitly admitting that the inference from statistics cannot stand completely by itself. You need some kind of socio-political reference to say that the statistical method is correct or the results obtained by this method are legitimate. So similarly, the Moholy-Nagy distance function is considered a legitimate method in this publication because the distances it reveals matches their preconceptions about the racial relation of caste groups. So for instance, it shows that, as I said, Bengali Muslims and other low caste regions, other low castes in the region have similar have a small distance, and Bengali Muslims don't have a racial relation with or racial similarity with the upper caste, and so there is no independent statistical logic by which to prove that this was indeed correct, but it is being verified by these assumptions that the statisticians carry into the sciences. And this shows that the social and political questions of the contemporary times impact the mathematical and statistical questions that are being asked, as well as the answers that are being given with the data available. Before wrapping up, I would like to make one final point briefly, and to say that the transition from the colonial to the post-colonial state formation also impacted the nature, content, motivation, and direction for the discipline. And this again shows that the socio-political context does not only motivate the emergence of such disciplines. So it's not as if these are factors that impact the emergence of the discipline when it's being formed. But then once formed, it is completely separate from socio-political concerns. But that these contexts and these motivations continue to shape the direction and the content, along with the intellectual developments, of course, the direction of the discipline. They continue to inform the course of the discipline. Now, for instance, one major shift moving towards the post-colonial decades was this increased need that we see among intellectuals, we see in their writings, we see in their speeches, to seek public or democratic validation for using statistics in state governance. Because for them, it was very important to distinguish themselves from the colonial state. So they were using sometimes the same kind of overarching methods, premises, and framework. They were also conducting census enumerations and sample surveys, right? But for them, it was essential to therefore be very careful about making that distinction. And for them, the major distinction was that while the colonial state imposed statistical techniques and methods on the public, there was no idea of consent or approval. They didn't need approval from the public because of the nature of the state. But the post-colonial state is very insistent that this is a democracy and we need public approval. So in their heads, the Indian intellectuals and statisticians and even like statesmen, politicians are convinced that this is the modern rational method to use for state governance. But at the same time, they don't want to seem to be imposing that. So there is a lot of insistence and awareness and anxiety around pedagogy, around disseminating and trying to make the public statistically minded, as this phrase comes up often. Because there is also a sense that people inherently mistrust or distrust statistics. It's understood as fabrication and lies among people. So there is this need or focus on making it seem democratic by trying to make people approve statistics. Even if they don't understand it, there has to be a sense among them that statistics is good for us and for the nation. So this also impacts then how the discipline or the focus of the discipline, because then it turns also towards pedagogy much more than it had done in the previous decades. This history then for us today enables us to ask or seek the following in other adjacent disciplines and developments. That is at least my hope. One is this idea of multiple origins. So a lot of significant STS scholarship has historicized statistical reasoning and objectivity, but mostly as these developed in the global north. Thus showing that statistics and numerical thinking, objectivity were not ahistorical natural categories, but these originated out of the intellectual and social needs of modernity in the global north. By discussing this history, by working on this history, I want to contribute to that argument by saying that it's not as if there is one history, that statistics is emerging in one context and then it is uniformly unproblematically applied in other contexts. But I'm showing that there are multiple such histories of emergence, multiple such histories of being motivated to form these disciplinary institutions and spaces. The second point is socio-political motivations to seek to analyze how socio-political motivations, along with intellectual motivations, impact the formation of other disciplines, impact the formation of questions, certain questions at certain times within these statistical sciences and other geopolitical contexts. And finally, it also encourages us, I hope, to think about questions about legitimation. How are disciplinary developments legitimized? Who seeks these legitimations? And where are these legitimations sought? These can be sought among a certain idea of the public. It can be sought among peers, within the framework of rationality, or with the logic of these sciences being utilitarian and good for like public welfare. I will leave you there. Thank you for your time.
So we have time for some questions for Sayori. Reinhardt.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your fantastic talk. Quite unexpected perspectives for me. Could you reflect a little bit more about the early history around 1900? How much was India already related to the International Statistical Institutes? How did it appear as an actor itself, or was it more under the colonial rule or under British statistics or whatever?
Right. Thank you so much for that question. I would say there were both aspects to it. It was a lot of these developments were happening under the colonial rule. And in fact, there was a lot of collaboration with the colonial state. The critiques were there, as I mentioned, but at the same time, say for someone like B.S. Guho, or there is another anthropologist and statistician, Dhirendranath Majumdar, when they are all going out to, say, revise colonial data, they are going out doing these census surveys, the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure in place for these is very much part of the colonial state. So they are in collaboration with colonial state. They use the, there is this instance, a few instances when Dhirendranath Majumdar is talking about how they needed to call the police, which of course would be part of the colonial state apparatus. When they went into a village, they wanted to collect some anthropometric data, and the villagers were suddenly very anxious and apprehensive about why these data was being collected. So they turned a bit violent. So then anthropologists had to seek the help of the colonial police to calm them down. So there is these like physical infrastructural collaborations that are happening. But at the same time, there are even a few instances of glimpses of Indian intellectuals being able to represent themselves as experts in certain international platforms. So in the early 20th century, this would be 1911, if I'm not mistaken, in London, we have the first Universal Races Congress, which is a lot of nations being represented. And the argument is that we need to use science, different kind of sciences, to bring the races of the world together, to create harmony and to do away with conflict and violence. And an important Indian intellectual is representing India at this conference. He presents a paper. His name is B.N. Sheel, and he's very important because he is the one who actually says, like one of the first people to talk about the importance of statistics in the Indian subcontinent, and he encourages intellectuals. He himself is a mathematician, philosopher. He encourages people to use statistics because he thinks that is the most rational, objective method to use statistics to engage in the study of the races of humankind. And his argument is that by studying humankinds in groups, human communities in this way, we will conduct such a rational study that we will ultimately achieve like peace. We will do away with conflict. We will see there is no basis for racial difference and conflict and so on. And B.N. Sheel is a person who actually directly encourages Mahalanobis to take up statistics because he thinks it is the most like objective, rational method. So there is both the colonial state collaboration and also the attempt of Indian intellectuals to represent themselves in international platforms.
First, Gemma, and then Karim.
Thank you so much. I'll ask two questions under the theme of legitimacy.
Okay.
So the first question is, I know that Fisher critiqued Pearson's I wrote CRL, now I'm writing coefficient of racial likeness.
Yes,
And I wondered if he similarly critiqued the distance function.
Pearson. Yes.
If Fisher
Yeah.
critiqued the distance function. Yeah, and then that's my first question. And then the second question is about the Indian Journal statistics and whether it focused exclusively on statistics about India, or if there was a desire to include statistics that were not specifically.
Correct. Yeah, thank you so much. So the first question, yes, Pearson hated it. Mohalanovic, in fact, worked at the UCL laboratory where Pearson worked, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so when he was working at the laboratory, I think he had a good time with Pearson. But once he came up with the critique of Pearson's coefficient of racial likeness, and he wrote this paper devising this particular formula, he actually sent it to Pearson first, and for Pearson's journal, Biometrica. And Pearson rejected it. So he had to then look for other avenues. Basically, Pearson says this is not a correct method, the way he's using standard deviation. And Pearson continues to use his method. But Pearson also had a rival in the UK, Ronald Fisher. Fisher was promoting Mohalanovic's formula a lot. Fisher really supported it and tried to publish it and tried to promote it, and kept saying, and this connects to your second question about collaborations or Shankar wanting to publish. They definitely did publish a lot of Indian material, but they were very focused also equally on not only bringing in European statisticians into the institute, having them deliver the presidential or the keynote speeches at conferences, but also publishing a lot of that data, because one of the motivations, as I said, would be like developing this network of international colleagues, because they wanted to appear not just as Indian experts relevant in the subcontinent, but globally relevant. But the other motivation was also this whole debate about standardization. So Mohalanovic is part of that. At this time, there is a lot of scientists, including statisticians, but not restricted to them, in a lot of countries who are starting to discuss this problem of having methods that are not standardized. So you don't know who is using what method to come up with a set of data. So if you have, say, racial data from India, and then you find corresponding racial data from, say, Sweden, because that is one of Mohalanovic's study as well, you don't know, or at least at this point, statisticians are not aware of how that data was formulated, what was the sample size, what was the classification, how a particular category was even defined, or which method. So for instance, somebody is using coefficient of racial likeness and somebody is using distance function. So there is a lot of talk among scientists at a global level to standardize the method so that they can use and verify each other's data sets. And Mohalanovic is very much a part of that debate of standardization. He's trying to do that for like across nations, but also within the discipline itself. And as part of that, then these international European statisticians are constantly invited, and they are brought in to endorse and recognize them. So Ronald Fisher's work is published in Shankar, and then Fisher is also invited to deliver the keynote address at 1930s statistical conference at ISI, the Statistical Institute. And that is where Fisher encourages all anthropologists to use distance function rather than coefficient of racial likeness.
Karine.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your talk. At some point, I was very interested. You mentioned the fact that Mohalanovic, if I understood correctly, made the point that being from India, he was better suited to deal with the data, and you evoked a debate in which the distance with respect to the data was invoked, which made me think that there was probably something like a debate about objectivity as a value. which is attached to science and can be debated and so on. So I wanted to understand better
Sure.
the context in which this debate took shape, developed, and especially whether it was restricted to statistics or whether it was a much more general discussion about values attached to science and so on.
Right. Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think I can answer part of it. And the other part is basically my, the emerging themes, the open question that I would say relevant is something that can be taken up by other disciplines. That's not something I do, but I would very much like to see if other disciplines can also if other disciplines also have similar histories and possibilities. So the objectivity argument, yes, very much. This, although they don't go into elaborate discussions or contentions about objectivity or what constitutes scientific objectivity or detachment or neutrality. But I think even though they don't use those terms explicitly, there is a very, for now in the statistical sciences, in those debates, there is very much an insistence, an explicit insistence that the statistical sciences have to have, they will of course have like theoretical developments, those are essential, but they will always need to be tied to practical applications and utility. And I think this very much ties to the whole nationalist project, because they are coming up in the context of and against the colonial statistics, and for them to be legitimate and distinct from that kind of endeavor, they have to present themselves as relevant for the national public, as relevant for public welfare. They are very much, in these debates, they are very much against the idea of science for the sake of science or pure science. Because for them, the nationalist project is very much at the forefront. It's not distinct from doing science. And for example, statistical sciences would have these methods and techniques of data collection which would be very time consuming and costly. So it always had to be for some higher, like larger nationalist welfare kind of purpose. Otherwise that wouldn't make sense for a country like India. So there is this idea that the legitimacy of these sciences, the credibility of these sciences do not come from the claim that they are removed from social reality and therefore unbiased, but because they are deeply rooted in the socio-political context. They are aware, as practitioners, they are aware of the context and they are responding to the context. So for instance, there is this debate whether for a country like India, because of its lack of economic resources at that time, because of its vastness in terms of number of people and demography and space, there is this debate whether the colonial census enumeration, the full enumeration where you're counting everyone, whether that makes sense at all, or whether you should shift to what Maulana Bish promotes, the random sample survey. You select a small sample and then extrapolate it for a larger data set. So there are these debates, and none of these debates are detached from the socio-political reality and context. But for the question, the very good question about other sciences, that is not something I study, but that is something that I think emerges from this history, from the history that I study. And I feel that's a question that can be explored by other sciences at this point, whether there is a discussion about objectivity and distance, or there is this constant reference to the socio-political reality. The only glimpse of an answer that I can provide is, even if not in the way that statistical sciences are evoking the socio-political context and reality, other sciences, physics, chemistry, and so on, at this point, at least in the colonial, anti-colonial context, they would still be, even while doing science, they would be referring to a certain kind of tradition, as scholars have shown. So there is a certain socio-political motivation in other sciences as well, at least in the sense that they constantly hark back to, say, an ancient past to show Indian physics and chemistry as becoming modern, but also not something that's happening for the first time. So building the continuity with ancient textual traditions, Islamic, Hindu, those kind of traditions. So there is, I would say, a different kind of socio-political motivation, at least in other sciences as well.
So I know there are other questions, but we're out of time. So I encourage you to talk to Sayori during the break and during the rest of the meeting, but for now, let's just thank her again for a lovely